Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is a Chapter 5 test review I told you I would send out. A couple of things. I'm going to go through this list. There's quite a few items on here, so make sure you cover these things. Go back and look at your notes. First things first, let's talk about determining population. When I ask you a question to determine the population, make sure you're specific about that. If it's talking about people in Canada who favor the National Hockey League, then make sure you're being specific on it's all Canadian adults, or just look at what's being written in the statement. All right, you need to know how to do an SRS. You need to know what a sampling frame. Remember, your sampling frame is basically the population of interest. What population is. You need to know that a census tries to take a survey of everybody. Voluntary response sample is when people feel strongly about something. Those are usually the ones that call in, and it tends to be a negative influence. Parameter versus population. Remember, parameter is to population as statistic is to sample. So if you see something that says that starts talking about the entire population or census, then more than likely I'm talking about the parameter. Or if I say something about a parameter, then you know more than likely that I'm talking about the population. Just a little side note, remember, you will never truly know what the true population parameter is unless you've taken a census. Then remember, statistic, that is your p-hat. So parameter is p, statistic is p-hat, and that is generated from your sample. And remember, whenever you take a sample, not all samples are going to produce the same statistic. However, over a series or over time, if you take enough samples, what will happen is your data will start to look fairly normal. Okay, will start to look fairly normal. Couple of things. Let's talk about sampling errors versus non-sampling errors. Sampling errors are caused by the act of taking a sample. Like, for instance, if you decide to do a SRS, or let's say you decide to do a census. Well, a lot of times when if you do a census of the United States, there might be some errors like undercoverage, where homeless people are not accounted for, or maybe people or students who live in dormitories are not accounted for, or maybe there's an overcoverage. So a sampling error is caused by the act of taking a sample. Okay, then that's this part right here. Random sampling errors. Your margin of error in a confidence statement includes only the random sampling error. So if you get a question about the margin of error, remember the only error that's included in it is the random sampling error. Some of the sampling errors that you might encounter: undercoverage, voluntary response. Okay. Now, as far as non-sampling errors, these are errors that are not related to the act of selecting a sample from the population, and that's even in a census. Some errors could be the processing error, whenever they're inputting the data into a computer. Maybe the response. Maybe people tend to lie when put in situations where they don't want to look stupid, or they don't want to be embarrassed. Non-response is maybe you fail to get someone to respond. Maybe they don't answer the telephone. Maybe they just walk away. Maybe they just hang up the phone. And also, the wording of the question is also a non-sampling error. Again, these four things are not included in the process of, or the act of taking a sample. Okay? Now, remember, let's go down here at the bottom here. A sample statistic are often used to estimate an unknown parameter. So, we're going to use the sample statistic, and if we've taken enough, or if the population or the sample size is large enough, just like in a couple of the examples we used, if the population is or the sample size is large enough, we can use it as an estimate for the unknown parameter. When estimating, there can be two types of errors. You can have bias and you can have variability. Remember, you can either have this would include high bias, this would include high bias. Your bias would tend to be towards the lower numbers. Bias would tend to be high. The most ideal is when it's balanced right in the middle. Okay, and in order to reduce bias, you would randomize the population or the sample size. Variability if your variability is really wide right here, then you can expect to have a high variability. If you have a picture of variability and it's really small, you will have low variability. And in order to reduce variability, you always increase your sample size. So if you do a sample that has a high, or if you take a sample and it's a very large sample, you've basically already reduced your variability by quite a bit. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next page. Okay, on this page, we look at the confidence statement. Now, make sure you include these things. You always state that we are 95% confident, because that's the confidence statement or level that we are at currently. That the true population parameter of whatever population you're studying. So make sure that the true population parameter and then ... of whatever you're covering is included. Will be contained within the interval. And remember, I don't care if it's a percentage or just decimals. Make sure it's consistent. Okay. Now, bias can be caused by non-response. It can be caused by voluntary response, telephone surveys, and the wording of a question. Now, if you notice, these are like we studied, or what I just put in the first page. These are non-sampling errors. Non-response, voluntary response, telephone surveys. Voluntary response is when, remember, that could be a sampling error because maybe you designed a sample that only elicits voluntary response. Okay, so non-response could be, or is a non-sampling error. So we've got a mixture of the two that would cause the bias, or that would cause bias in your sample. So bias can be caused by non-response, voluntary response, telephone surveys, and of course the wording of the question. Let's talk about the margin of error real quick. Remember, your margin of error is your p-hat minus your mho and p-hat plus your mho. So that means your p-hat is in the middle. That's why we say plus margin of error and minus margin of error. So when I say your p-hat plus or minus the margin of error, your p-hat is directly in the middle of a confidence interval. So don't forget that. If I don't give you a margin of error, well, there's an easy way of finding it out, and that is 1 over the square root of n. So remember, n is your sample size. Okay? N is your sample size. Let me go ahead and erase this right quick. And I'm going to blow this up a little bit. Alright, let me make this a little bit larger. Okay, now, if the margin of error is not given, always use plus or minus 3%. Just like if I don't give you a confidence interval or confidence statement, it's always 95% confidence. So 95% confident goes hand in hand with the 3% margin of error if it is not given. And then finally, the variability of a statistic from a random sample does not depend on the size of the population, as long as the population is at least 10 times larger than the sample. I hope all these little tidbits help in studying for your test tomorrow, and good luck, and we'll see you on Monday.